So, this guy, William Herbert Wallace, is just living his boring little life in Liverpool, 1931. He wakes up, goes to work, sells some insurance, comes home to his wife, repeats. Nothing crazy, nothing out of the ordinary. And then, one night, he walks through his front door and finds his wife, Julia Wallace, brutally murdered in their own living room, beaten to death, blood everywhere, the fire still burning in the fireplace. The door locked from the inside, and the worst part, the last person she saw was him. This is the haunting and unsolved murder of Julia Wallace, a case so bizarre that even Sherlock Holmes would have looked at it and said, "Yeah, I got nothing." All right, let's back up. It's Liverpool, England, 1931, and William Wallace is the kind of guy who you'd pass on the street and forget immediately. He's 52, tall, a little stiff, a little awkward. Works as an insurance agent for Prudential Assurance Company, which, if we're being honest, is just as boring as it sounds. He's been married to Julia Wallace for about 16 years, and their life is fine. Not exciting, not terrible, just fine. Now, Wallace isn't exactly a social butterfly, but there's one thing he actually enjoys: chess. It's his only real hobby. Every Monday night, like clockwork, he shows up to the Liverpool Central Chess Club where he plays a few matches, maybe has a drink, then goes home. And this is where things start getting weird. On Monday, January 19th, 1931, Wallace arrives at the chess club like usual. But before the match starts, the club captain comes up to him and says, "Hey, someone left a message for you." Apparently, a man had called the club earlier that evening asking for Wallace by name. The caller, who said his name was R.M. Qualtrough, left a message for Wallace to meet him the next night at 7:30 p.m. at 25 Menlove Gardens East to discuss an insurance policy. Seems normal, right? Except there's no such person as R.M. Qualtrough, and Menlove Gardens East doesn't exist. Hey, this story is just getting started. Hit that subscribe button and stay tuned for more here on Talescape. Now, Wallace doesn't know this yet. So the next evening, January 20th, 1931, he follows the instructions, gets on a tram, and heads out to find this address. And this is important. Multiple people see him leave his house around 6:45 p.m., meaning his alibi for the night begins here. Once Wallace gets to the area, he starts asking around. But after knocking on doors, asking strangers, and wasting over an hour wandering the streets like a lost tourist, he realizes this address does not exist. So, annoyed and confused, he finally gives up and heads home. And when he walks through his front door, his wife is dead, bludgeoned to death in their living room. Now, let's talk about this crime scene because it is insane. Julia's body is crumpled next to the fireplace, lying in a pool of her own blood. She's been beaten at least 11 times with something heavy, probably an iron pipe or a metal bar. There's blood splattered across the walls, soaked into the carpet, even pooling under the furniture. The killer was not in a hurry. This was a deliberate, brutal, rage-filled attack. And yet, nothing was stolen. Julia had cash in her purse, valuable jewelry in the house, and it was all untouched. The police arrive, and from the very beginning, they are side-eyeing Wallace hard. Because for a guy who just found his wife beaten to death, he's weirdly calm. He tells police in a flat, emotionless voice, "Oh dear, she's been killed." Yeah, that's it. No screaming, no panic, just "oh dear," like he just knocked over a cup of tea. And the cops? They don't buy it. In their eyes, this is an open and shut case. Wallace made up the whole mystery client as an excuse to get out of the house, killed his wife, and then staged the whole thing to look like a random murder. But there's one massive problem. The door was locked from the inside, which means whoever killed Julia never left the house. And if Wallace was really the killer, then how the hell did he lock the door behind him from the outside? This case just went from simple to impossible. And the more the police investigate, the weirder it gets. All right, so now we have a brutally murdered woman, a locked room mystery, and a husband who is way too calm about the whole thing. And if you think this case is going to start making sense anytime soon, no, absolutely not. Because from here on out, it only gets weirder. Let's talk timeline. The last confirmed sighting of Julia Wallace alive was at 6:30 p.m. on January 20th, 1931. She spoke to a neighbor, completely normal, no signs of distress, very much still breathing. Now, Wallace himself left the house around 6:45 p.m., and multiple people saw him physically leave to go search for this mystery client, R.M. Qualtrough. That means if he was the killer, he had a 15-minute window to somehow bludgeon his wife to death. Not a quick crime, since she was hit at least 11 times. Clean himself up, because after a beating like that, he would have been covered in blood. Lock the house from the inside, and still make it out the door on time. And if that sounds completely impossible, that's because it probably was. But the police, they didn't care. Because in their minds, this was a husband kills wife situation. And statistically, they weren't wrong. Spouses are always the first suspects in these cases. So they start digging into Wallace's behavior that night. And here's what they don't like. When he got home and discovered Julia's body, he was too calm. When he flagged down a neighbor to help, he barely reacted. Just told them, "Come look at this." And then there was his reaction to seeing his dead wife. Not horror, not grief, just a casual, "Oh dear, she's been killed." Yeah, not exactly the most heartbroken husband reaction, but here's what's really weird. When police first arrived, they actually couldn't find the murder weapon. They searched the house twice and found nothing. Then, 2 weeks later, they suddenly find a blood-stained iron bar hidden in the house. Now, either Wallace was so confident that he straight up left the murder weapon in his own home, or, and hear me out, maybe the police really wanted this case to be wrapped up neatly. And then, there's the biggest piece of evidence against Wallace, the mystery phone call. Remember, the whole reason Wallace was out of the house that night was because someone called his chess club and left a message telling him to go to an address that didn't exist. And after looking into it, police decide, yep, Wallace must have made that call himself. Their theory? Wallace left his house earlier in the evening, went to a phone box half a mile from his home, called the chess club pretending to be R.M. Qualtrough, left himself the message, then walked back home and killed Julia. But here's the problem. The chess club manager who took the call, he swore that the voice sounded nothing like Wallace. And on top of that, there was zero evidence connecting Wallace to the phone box. No witnesses, no records, just a gut feeling from the cops. But at this point, they had made up their minds. Wallace was arrested for murder, and the whole thing was about to go to trial. All right, so at this point, William Wallace is on trial for murder. The police have no solid evidence, no clear motive, and their whole case is basically built on, we just don't like the guy. But somehow, he gets convicted, yeah. Wallace goes to trial in April 1931, and the prosecution paints him as a cold, calculated killer who staged an impossible crime to throw off the police. They claim he faked the mysterious phone call to give himself an alibi, then murdered Julia, cleaned himself up, locked the house, and calmly went on his way. And despite the fact that there was zero physical evidence linking him to the crime, the jury takes just 1 hour to find him guilty. William Herbert Wallace is sentenced to death. But here's where things take a massive turn. Because unlike most people who get convicted of murder in the 1930s, Wallace actually gets an appeal. And not just any appeal. His conviction gets completely overturned, making him one of the very first people in British history to have a murder conviction fully reversed. Why? Because the judges take one look at the case and go, yeah, this is absolute nonsense. Their exact words? No real proof of guilt has been established. Translation, the cops made this up. And just like that, Wallace walks free. Now, you'd think that would be the end of it. Guy gets accused of murder, guy gets released, case closed. But no, because no one else was ever charged. For the rest of his life, Wallace was followed by whispers. His name was ruined. People never stopped suspecting him. Even though the conviction was overturned, even though the case was full of holes, he never escaped the label of wife killer. And 2 years later, Wallace died, at just 54 years old, from chronic health issues. Some say it was stress, others say he just gave up, and the case never solved. For nearly a century, people have debated what really happened in that locked room. Some believe Wallace was the perfect criminal, that he somehow pulled off the impossible, staged an elaborate alibi, and got away with the perfect murder. Others think he was just a socially awkward, unlucky man who got railroaded by cops looking for an easy conviction. And then, there's a third theory, that the killer was someone else entirely. Because remember, this wasn't a robbery. Nothing was stolen. This was rage. And Julia Wallace, she had a secret life. She was known to keep large sums of cash at home. Some sources say she had a mysterious past before she met Wallace, one that she never talked about. And some believe that on that night in 1931, the person who knocked on her door wasn't her husband, but someone from her past. Someone she knew. Someone she let in. But since the case was never reopened, we'll probably never know the truth. The murder of Julia Wallace remains one of the greatest mysteries in British history. A locked room case that should have been impossible, an investigation that made no sense, and a man who may or may not have gotten away with murder. And the only person who really knew what happened took the truth to the grave. Thanks for tuning in to Talescape. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories where ambition meets chaos and sometimes history.